Where there are gods, there are also religion. And where there's religion, you can also find temples and churches. These are the places where the worshippers in your setting go to pay tribute to the gods and most likely acquire some knowledge. Today's video is designed to give you some inspiration for developing temples and churches for your own fantasy setting. Let's get into it. Hi guys, my name is Jesper and welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. This channel is all about giving you inspiration to master your craft and create fantasy that will truly immerse your audience. I'm currently developing Module 6 for our future course on fantasy world building, and as I touched upon religion, I got the idea to create a video that focuses on the buildings that are symbolic of religion. So now this video isn't going to cover the development of gods, pantheons and religion, but instead see it as a tour around a fantasy city where today's stop is at the temple and the church. Religion might play a larger or a smaller part in your setting or in your story, but religion is just a subject that is very hard to ignore. People want to believe, and for almost every culture on earth, religion has at some point been at its core. So, with temples and churches built for the purpose of religious and spiritual activities such as prayer, meditation, sacrifice and worship, it's good to know that the earliest temples were constructed in places where people felt the presence of the gods to be in some way particularly strong. Try to decide what needs the builders of your temple or church had when they built it. Was it to crown a sacred ground where a god actually did walk at some point? Was it to bring sacrifices to the gods, in which case you should probably create a means within the building to allow for perhaps livestock to be kept if that's what's going to be sacrificed? Or is the temple or church a more political function, in which case you might want to locate it close to other buildings of power in your setting? The word temple actually goes back to around the 6th century BC, where Romans used it for places of worship. Though the oldest known temple is Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, I think that's how you say it, which is 11,500 years old. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? If you take a look at ancient Egypt, the temple was considered the point at which a god came into existence. Whether you want your temples to be literal home for the gods, where the priests care for the gods as they would a living person, or if you want to have it more like a symbolic representation, it's really up to you. However, looking at the origin and the reason for having the temple or church is a fruitful way in which you can come up with ideas for how worshippers act and how it affects the city and the culture around these holy places. A temple or church is interesting, but if you can think of ways that makes these buildings special and how it serves the community, it just makes it so much better. It shouldn't just be a building, so to speak. It's a place or purpose and meaning. Why did the local population think it important to build? Why did they build it in this exact spot? Why is it constructed in the way it is? These are the sort of questions that you should look to answer, and it will deepen the level of immersion. Let me add some information to the medieval church as well, because back in the day it played a far greater role in medieval Europe than it does now. I think there are some further things we can learn from it and thus improve our own world building. You see, in medieval times, the church was a dominating factor in everybody's lives. It didn't really matter if you were a peasant or a person of prominent standing. You would believe in God, heaven and hell. That was done or ensured by teaching the word of the Bible from a very early age and tell people that the only way to enter heaven was if the church allowed it. I'm not here to say whether believing in God is right or wrong. I'm just looking at this topic from the perspective of world building, because a setting in which the church plays this dominant role also begs the questions as to where you can find some seeds for great stories. Could a more political agenda be at play in a setting where the church is almost in total control? Does your population truly believe in the gospel? Do they just say that they believe in order to not get into trouble? And if that is the case, how will it shape the culture of such a nation? In medieval times, people would also have to pay 10% of their yearly earnings to the church. If you had little money, you could pay in seeds, harvested grain, you could pay with animals or something else that you possessed. And here again, you can start asking yourself questions that will help you to understand the customs of the inhabitants in your world. Are seeds hard to come by, and if so, how do people feel about giving 10% of it away to the church? How do the church enforce and collect their 10% share? And what happens if you refuse to pay? Will the church take it by force, or will they just condemn you to eternity in hell? In your most important cities, you could decide to add cathedrals. Some of the most famous ones are Canterbury and York in England. Cathedrals are vast even by modern standards, but back then they could easily be larger than royal palaces. If that was the case in your setting, how does that make your king feel? Does he think that the church should start to pay taxes? If so, what conflict would occur if he tries to enforce his will upon the church? This brings me on to fortified churches, in fact, because a few examples of such churches would be the Cathedral of Avila, which was incorporated into the town wall, or Leriens Abbey stands surrounded by a wall too. In Germany you find the impressive Kirchenburg Ostheim, which has external defenses such as curtain walls and wall towers as well. It's basically kind of a fortress on its own right. By adding such locations to your setting, if you want to do that, you are also giving the church and temples, if you're applying the same kind of defense capability to the temples too, but you're giving them military might. This could give the church influence over national politics, but it could, of course, also be that they are strong allied to the king rather than adversaries. You see, my mind always looks for the conflict, so that's where I naturally go. That's just the storyteller in me. All right, that was a lot of questions to ask yourself, but world building is essentially about asking questions and coming up with answers that makes the outcome, let's say, as interesting as you can possibly make it. So in a moment, I'll give you another reflection that could function as a creative spin for you. But first, let me ask you if you know that I share new videos every single Monday. Because if this is your first time here, do make sure to subscribe and learn to master the craft of creating immersive fantasy worlds, settings, and characters. A real good piece of advice when it comes to adding depth to your religion is to consider its history, because this will inform its current strength and how widespread the religion is. So think about whether or not your religion is growing or shrinking. Are new temples and churches appearing across the landscape, or are these buildings more and more viewed as old relics? Since belief systems has such an influence on society, giving some serious thought to its origin can help to add some realism. If temples, for instance, are being abandoned, consider why that is. What changed about the relationship with the population to cause this sort of a change? Personally, I really love pictures of ancient abandoned temples. It gives me so much inspiration and raises even more great questions as to what happened. You see, in this video, I haven't gone down into detail about how to develop the building itself, because that is by far less interesting than looking at all the surrounding area, like population, belief systems, religion, and the sort of things I've been talking about here, because that is what brings immersion. In writing, I'm just going through some proofreading on book 1 and book 2 of the Keystone Bone Trilogy. I think this is the third time these books are being proofread, but it's amazing how errors can slip through no matter how many people look at it. Anyways, I'm doing that as a preparation for adding both books together with book 3 into a box set. It's only going to be a little more than a month and book 3 will be out. 3 years in the making, imagine that. Next up, I'm going to get into writing a non-fiction book on how to plot a novel, and I'm looking forward to get going on that. Probably sometime next week, I guess. If you haven't done so already, don't forget to follow me on social media, and stay safe out there, and see you next Monday.